everybody. This is International Master Sam Shankland, and I'm here to do my final part of the Roy Lopez series. I left off after move 41, rook to e3, in the game Judith Polgar, Alexander Morozevich, where I gave viewers, until this video comes out, a while to figure out what they think black should do here. And I should point out that this was a rapid game. It was game in 25, obviously still a bit higher quality than I would say any of my games or any of the people watching this video's games. But the fact that it's a rapid game allowed white to make this blunder, rook to e3. So now Morozevich capitalized, and if you didn't take time over the last, I guess, few days to try to figure out what black's best move is here, I'll give you a couple seconds to now. So if you want to pause the video, go ahead. Okay, so the move is rook to b1, giving the king a little check. And unfortunately, there's no appropriate way for white to deal with this, because bishop to f1, blocking the check, runs into queen b5 with a pin on the bishop, which should just be winning. For example, the only real ways to stop it are queen to e2 and rook to e2. If queen e2, black can probably just take the queen, rook takes, and just start taking pawns over here. Rook takes a5 is coming next. And white will not really have a good way of getting out of the pin. Black also will be able to quickly play f5 and start to make counterplay in the center. And rook to e2 is probably a little bit tougher to crack, but I'm sure there's plenty of good options for black here. I think one of them, for example, would be just rook to a1 again, and very simple, pick up this pawn. Nothing white can do about it. And again, it's very hard to break the pin. And also, you should look here, the cute tactic, rook to e1. Oh my god, I'm attacking the rook, and I just uncovered an attack on the queen. Well, unfortunately, you're not breaking the pin, and the bishop cannot take the queen, because it is pinned to the king. So, white, essentially, after rook b1 check, must play king h2, which she did, but now the rook comes back to b2, and the f-pawn goes. Black wins a pawn, and he doesn't even win the a-pawn, which he was likely to win in the long run anyway. So he's probably going to be up not one, but two pawns. Also, except for maybe like the g-pawn, or which covers white's king, the f-pawn is probably the most important pawn in the position for white, because with the f-pawn gone, black will be able to pressure the e-pawn as well, and there's not ever going to be a really sufficient way to protect it. Queen to c1, rook takes f2, queen to e1. So as I alluded to in the previous video, that video mostly covered what black did to achieve a 1 position. At this point, black has a 1 position, but he has to go on and win it, which is often a difficult thing to do, especially against a player of Polgar's caliber. So black here plays queen to b2, and white plays bishop e2. White had to protect himself, or herself, against the threat of rook takes g2 check, and this was the best way to do it because it breaks the coordination of the queen and the rook. So, for example, a move like bishop f1 would probably be less effective. Among other things, I think now black might even start to play moves like f5 and make counterplay on the king side and in the center. So, bishop to e2, forcing black to move the rook, but now rook f4 threatens this pawn, which has to be defended, so bishop f3. And now rook to h4. So after queen e1, if you can see, it was a little bit of a tricky situation for black, but basically what he did was he found a way to get his queen into b2, and now he's going to maneuver his rook back around into the game this way, which seems to be how he's going to go about things. If you remember way back in the previous lecture when I talked about the merits of h takes g5 rather than queen takes g5, I think this is definitely a clear one. H takes g5 has helped black in a big way, because this rook will have a new route back to the game. White plays queen to g3, starting to make threats to some of the black pawns, most notably the g5 pawn. So a perfectly acceptable move here would be to play f6, but this is not quite in Morozevich's style, I guess. So he played a different move, queen to d2, which counterattacks more important stuff. If queen takes g5, I'm sure he had many things on his mind, but rook takes e4 does seem to do the trick here, because this rook is fatally pinned, rook can't take the rook because of queen takes queen. And if the bishop takes, then after knight takes rook, the queen has to move, and it must relinquish defense of the e3 rook, which will lead to black being up a piece and winning the game. So, white played rook to e2, and now queen f4 forces the queens to come off rather shortly. So white played the best move, rook to b2, starting to create counterplay. And Morozevich took the pawn on e4. Now, white, practically speaking, often in these cases would like to refrain from exchanging queens, because with the queens on, there's always more threats to be made. Obviously, this is not happening anytime soon, but if you can imagine white playing rook to b8 and queen to e1 to b4 to c4 to c8, obviously this is extremely far-fetched. But at some point, the queen and the rook on the back rank are capable of making very real threats. And for this reason, the side that's defending usually wants to keep more pieces on board to try to create more chances to trick their opponent. But in this case, the queens have to get traded. So, because if white plays bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, then the pawn on d5 is very likely to be falling. So, if black wins a second pawn, especially in the center, it's over. Also, black has the option here of playing queen takes g3, king takes g3, rook takes e4. And still trading the queens, which is with a similar position to the game. So white elected to trade queens right away. Black would like to take back with the g-pawn and play like f5 and start to push the center. Unfortunately, this would hang the knight, so he really can't. Takes back with the rook, of course. Now the knight is defended. White takes the knight anyway, takes back, and now rook to b6. Black is currently up 2 pawns, but he's going to lose at least one of them back. So he's still going to have sort of a tricky rook ending to win, but Morozevich found an excellent way to win the game. He plays rook to a4. So now white's hand is forced. She can't take the pawn on d6 because then black takes on a5 and remains 2 pawns up with an easily won position. For example, something like rook to d8 is likely, rook to a1, d6, rook d1, d7, a5, and eventually this pawn's just going to roll down the board. White's going to have to get behind it with the rook, so he might as well do it now. Takes, and now let's say f6. We have a pretty easily winning 4-on-2 rook and pawn endgame here. So white basically has to capture the pawn on a6, which defends the pawn that Morozevich was attacking. So white is now won a pawn back and is in position to potentially win a second over here. Black plays e4, pushing the passed pawn. And if black plays e3 next move and can follow it up with rook e4, he will have an easily winning position because white cannot stop the pawn. For example, if white plays a silly move like g3, after e3, I think black is probably just winning. So white played king to g3. And now e3 is not as effective because after king to f3, the pawn is firmly held. Black can try the little trick rook to e4. And white definitely should not take this rook because then after e2, the pawn cannot be stopped from queening. But after king to e2, this pawn is still firmly blockaded, and white actually now probably can make a draw in the game because she will quickly take this pawn, and then she'll have these 2 pawns, and in order to win some of them, black will have to go up the e3 pawn. It will likely end up with a 3, these 3, on these 2, which will not be winning for black, I don't think. But Morozevich is a very precise player, and he did not fall for such foolishness. He plays king to f6. Trying to bring his king into the game. If he can play king to e5 safely and take this pawn, the game is definitely over. There is no way at all that Polgar will be able to deal with 2 connected passed pawns. This move may at first look like a blunder because white can play rook takes d6 with check now. So pawns are actually for the moment equal, but unfortunately the ending is still dead lost for white after king to e5. Because this rook is under attack, white is definitely going to have to give back 1 pawn. If, for example, rook d7 trying to threaten this pawn, f5, this a pawn is going to fall, and if rook a7, then the d pawn is going to fall. So Polgar decided to get behind the d pawn so that she could play d6, d7 and try to get counterplay. Morozevich grabbed the a pawn and is now threatened to take the d pawn. So d6, rook g3 check. Or sorry, rook a3 check, attacking the king on g3. And now the position is close to hopeless, I believe, for the white player. Because there is no way that she will be able to stop black's impending pawn storm with a 4-on-2, and black will easily just put his rook behind this one pawn to stop that. So Polgar bravely moves forward, but now Morozevich plays f5. I think king f2 is probably a better practical chance, but after something like f5, d7, king to d6, I think it's very unlikely Polgar would have any kind of reasonable chance at making a draw in the game. I'm sure instead of this, Morozevich could also play something like rook to d3, and if d7, king to f6, let's say, to try to just quickly make sure this pawn is unwinnable. There's plenty of ways to win. Also, king to f4 looks strong, with the idea of d7, rook to a2 check. If the king moves back to some random square, we play rook to d2, and the rook is still unable to move out from behind the pawn because there's no way to check the black king. Black's next move will be f5, so he won't even be able to try to like take this f pawn. Realize that if rook f8 now, rook takes d7, and this pawn cannot be taken because it's defended. And if after rook a2 check, white goes king e1 to try to cut the rook off of the d2 square, then black can play king e3, and the rook still has no way of getting out from behind the pawn because rook a1 checkmate is threatened. And if something like king to f1, well, rook a1 is still mate. And if king to d1, black can start even taking more pawns because the rook still cannot move away from the defend pawn because of rook d2 check, followed by rook takes d7. So there's really just no, this is probably the most accurate way, is just king to f4 very fast, and it doesn't seem like there is any real way for white to defend. White can try to play g3 check, pitching a pawn with the idea that now the king is in a better spot. It won't be forced to the back rank, but again, after rook to d3, there's no way of bringing the rook out from behind this pawn. So this looks like it's just a very easy win for black. So Polgar bravely charges forward with king to g4. And Morozevich plays very precisely now. f5 check, king takes g5, rook g3 check, king h6, rook takes g2. So now Morozevich is still up a pawn, but more importantly, he has two connected passed pawns. And the only real pawn white can try to win now is the g6 pawn, but that won't be so important. For example, after, let's say, d7 here, king e6, white can try to pick up this g6 pawn in exchange for the d pawn. If they could somehow pick up the f pawn instead, they might have some chances to draw because the e pawn would be weak. But with these two connected passers here against this lone one on h3, the game is not even close to being savable for white. So white played h4, just biding her time, I guess. King to e6, d7, king e7, rook g8 takes, and now h5. So white, black obviously now cannot take this pawn in view of rook takes g2. White will create a passed pawn, but it doesn't seem to be too threatening, because after e3, if we take this, for example, e2, white just can't stop this pawn from making a queen. So white played rook g6, rook g7 check, king e8, rook takes g6. So now it still requires a little bit of precision from black to win the game, although, albeit not too much. So if rook takes g6 now, for example, hg6, e2, well now g7, and white's going to have really good chances to draw because they will make a queen as well. And if king f7, king h7, this changes nothing. But black found a very nice move here, e2. And so now if you look at this, rook takes g2 is impossible because black will make a new queen. So this is easily winning for black, and white has to somehow stop this pawn, so of course rook to e6 check, but now king f7 attacking the rook. Rook has to again find a move. There's only two squares that are okay, e3 and e5. If the rook goes to e3, black plays f4 with tempo. White moves his rook, black plays f3. And note that white can never try to just take this f pawn because again, this rook always has to stay on the e file, or else the e pawn queens, as it does now in this variation. So, although the position is completely lost, Polgar did find the best practical defense, rook to e5. And now king to f6, rook to e8, f4, king h7, f3, h6. White's just trying to somehow make some threats. If white had a couple moves, for example, let's say black shuffles for a second, and lets white play h7 and now plays f2, well, then the position has become extremely different because white has possibilities of playing for stalemate in the corner here. For example, here I think rook takes e2 is an immediate draw, because after f1 queen, rook takes g2, it seems that there is no way to avoid a stalemate. If queen takes g2, the position is stalemate, and it's an unfortunate position of the black king, because if the black king could play king f7, now next move queen a1 would be checkmate, but white can start checking. And I'm not actually 100% sure what the correct result of this should be. Black still may be able to win, but we just gave white 2 tempi in a row, which was completely unnecessary. So after h6, f2, Polgar resigned in view of Morozevich making a new queen, and there was just nothing she could do about it. She did fight very valiantly this game, and perhaps in a longer game would have had more chances to hold the draw, but in this case, she could not quite hold up. And Morozevich won, in my view, a very nice game. So I'd like to go back to the beginning and talk about a couple key moments in this game, just as a sum up of a very long 71 move game. So we just go through the opening real quickly. And I think the first real key moment was in this position, when black chose to play b4. This is a very aggressive move that I think is very strong, and it's really aiming to open up the queen side. And then the very next move is also a key moment, where white plays d5, which breaks the central tension, or basically removes the central tension rather than breaks it, because she didn't actually capture anything. So I think that here, black has already basically done okay out of the opening. He's definitely not worse, but in fact, white may have fallen for a trap. I don't know. I don't know too much direct theory about the Ruy Lopez rather than the opening themes behind it. But after d5, the center got closed. And if you look, black played c6. And then after c4, the biggest thing that he did, I think, to make sure he ended up with an advantage in this game was to maintain the tension for a while, because he realized that white would never really be able to break the tension, so he could set up his pieces optimally before breaking the tension. And if white was somehow more diligent and tried to, like, really, let's say, buckle up, if they had played like bishop a3, bishop c8, queen e2, bishop d7, rook c1, white's really geared toward breaking that side, well then maybe black basically has paralyzed white, because white needs to have all his pieces there ready to combat the breaking of the tension. And here maybe black will start to play moves like g6, knight h5, f5, and try to play on the other side of the board. So basically black holding the tension here is what allowed him to create such a dominant position. So a while later, the next key moment was, I believe, when white elected to not take back with the c-pawn here, rather take on f6 with the bishop, and then play knight takes d5, which is not a bad choice, but it's another key moment to look at. C takes d5 would have led to a different kind of position, although in this case, I definitely believe that black will have an advantage after a move like rook to b4 or queen to c5, starting to make serious threats where it's very hard to see how white is going to deal with all of them properly. And then later on, I think the biggest key moment was white's decision here to play knight takes g5. I think this is, while it wasn't the losing move, it was the move that basically sent the game so far down the path towards being a lost position that it was too much to overcome and too much to fight back. So I think if white had played a move like, let's say, rook to e2, with the idea of trying to defend the second rank, maybe go to a2 if the knight takes on a5. For example, now if bishop d5, e d5, knight a5, rook a2, there's just no way that black's going to hold on to the a6 pawn. But, and also with ideas of maybe going to b2 in some cases. And this is a very committal theme after knight takes g5, and I think that this is basically the point where white lost the game, even though it only moved 28 of a 71 move long battle. So that is it for my series on the Ruy Lopez. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching. This is Sam Shankland.